The Civil Rights Act of 1964. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 is a civil rights law that ended segregation in public places and prohibited employment discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, or sex. After the Civil War and during Reconstruction, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were passed that abolished slavery, made former slave citizens, and gave all men the right to vote regardless of race. These prompted the Civil Rights Movement. Leading up to the 1964 Act, other civil rights laws were passed in the 50s and 60s, but were only moderately successful. Because of this new legislative activity, organizations such as the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference staged sit-ins, boycotts, and freedom rides. The Act of 1964 was first proposed by President John F. Kennedy, where it was met with strong opposition from Southern members of Congress. After Kennedy's assassination, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed it into law. Due to the Civil Rights Act, people of different race, gender, and religion are treated much more equally and can get jobs easier or go anywhere they want to without worrying about segregation. However, rights for minorities, while they have improved enormously in the past century, still are not where they should be, which is evident in cases like where white cops are discriminatory against black citizens. But with groups like Black Lives Matter, it's easy to see how minorities are still fighting for equal rights. In later years, Congress expanded the Act and also passed additional legislation aimed at bringing equality to African Americans. For example, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 made way for this new Voting Rights Act. The Voting Rights Act of 1965. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 is an act passed after the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that outlawed racial discrimination in voting. It enforced the 15th Amendment of the Constitution and disallowed the practice of poll taxes and literacy tests, which made it very difficult for African Americans to vote. The act was signed into office by President Lyndon B. Johnson on August 6, 1965. Voting rights activists staged a peaceful march from Selma, Alabama to the state capital, Montgomery. However, they were met by Alabama state troopers and were brutally attacked when they refused to turn back. The incident was broadcast on TV over the whole nation. After the march, Johnson called for a comprehensive voting rights legislation and eventually passed the Voting Rights Act to stop situations where blacks would show up to vote only to be told they had the date wrong or had to recite the Constitution. These were a few examples where whites would try to deter blacks from voting. Johnson signed the act into law with Martin Luther King Jr. and other civil rights leaders. Now, this act is considered one of the most successful civil rights legislation acts in United States history. African Americans can now vote without being turned away or racial discrimination. Both acts encouraged civil rights equality in the United States and were made in the 1960s, adding to the many Great Society programs President Lyndon Johnson's administration put into effect. The Great Society was a set of programs launched by President Johnson from 1963 to 1968 after Kennedy's assassination. It was made to stop racial discrimination and help the poor. It had the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. But it also contained other acts such as the Higher Education Facilities Act of 1963 and the Food Stamp Act of 1964 for a few examples. The Voting and Civil Rights Acts dealt mostly with discrimination and fixing it. Now, because of them, our society is much more equal.